And Céad piece of Ella. Our next piece of business is private members' business, the Ban on Rent Increases Bill, second stage, and I call on Deputy Owen O'Brien to move the second reading motion.
So move.
Is that agreed? It's agreed. Deputy O'Brien, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you. I'm sharing time with a number of colleagues, so I'll take the first 5 minutes. Ceann Comhairle, the very first piece of legislation I introduced after being elected to the Dáil was the Rent Certainty Bill 2016. At that stage, rents had already been rising sharply for 2 years previous, and the purpose of that bill was to link rent reviews to an index such as the Consumer Price Index. Given that CPI was at virtually zero at that stage, that would have constrained rents and given renters a break. Unfortunately, a coalition of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael deputies on the floor of the Dáil that night defeated the bill. And in fact, not only once, but on 5 separate occasions during the course of the last Dáil, legislation and amendments tabled by Sinn Féin and other opposition spokespersons to do exactly that were blocked by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And the impact of those votes was very significant. Rents continued to spiral out of control and renters continued to be burdened with ever-increasing rents, not only placing themselves in enormous financial hardship, but also damaging the local economy because, of course, that reduced their disposable income to be spending in local goods and services. The introduction of the rent pressure zones starting from January 2017 did very little to constrain that rental inflation, and even though it was meant to cap rents at 4% annually, in and of itself, of course, too high, it did nothing of the sort. So many loopholes and so little effective policing in the early stages of that regime meant that, in fact, for many renters, increases over the last 4 years have been in the region of 18 to 38%, depending on where one lives. What that means in financial terms is for those renters who have experienced the burden of rent increases because of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael's objection to rent certainty are today paying anything between €4,500 and €6,500 more than they would have otherwise paid if the Sinn Féin bill was supported in 2016. And the problem now, of course, is rents are so high that linking rents to inflation simply isn't enough. That was a policy for 4 or 5 years ago, not for today. And the reason, of course, is that inflation is rising. The most recent figures from the Central Statistics Office show very clearly that the harmonised index of consumer 1.9% and is on an upward trajectory. So, of course, for the overwhelming majority of renters, no rent increase is currently acceptable, not 4%, not 3%, not 2%. And it's because of that that Sinn Féin is retabling our ban on rent increases legislation. The legislation is very simple. It seeks to give renters a 3-year breathing space, an emergency ban on rent increases for 3 years. And of course, it's one of 3 key measures Sinn Féin has been arguing for a number of years. We also want to see rents reduced. We believe the quickest and most legally sound way of doing this is a refundable tax credit that would put a month's rent back in every renter's pocket. And we also need to see dramatic increases in direct state investment in affordable cost rental to deliver somewhere in the region of, on average, 4,000 affordable cost rental units annually, with rents somewhere between €700 and €900, depending on size and location. There are 2 arguments that were made against rent certainty when we introduced it, and there are 2 arguments that are often made against a ban on rent increases now that we make it. The first is it will discourage new supply in the market. I do not accept that, particularly given the scale of investment that we're advocating for cost rental. But the idea that any private investor could not make a reasonable return where rents are at the highest point since the Celtic Tiger, in fact higher, makes no sense. There's also an argument that it could be unconstitutional, and again, eminent professors of constitutional law in Trinity College have debunked this. But also, we had a 2-year ban on rent increases before, introduced by Fine Gael and Labour, and therefore, if that was constitutional, so too would a 3-year ban, in my view. Ceann Comhairle, our rental system is broken. Renters simply cannot take any more. Linking rents to inflation at this point is the wrong policy. We need something much more dramatic, much more urgent, and that is why an emergency 3-year ban on rent increases, coupled with the other policies I've outlined, is the only approach that's going to give renters a break. And therefore, for any deputy of this House who wants to stand up for renters, they have no other choice but to support this bill, and I commend it to the House.
Thank you, Deputy Mitchell.
For years now, we in Sinn Féin, led by Deputy Eoin O'Brien, have called for a rent freeze to stop out-of-control rents getting higher and higher and hammering young people. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and their vested interest property speculators have allowed the so-called housing market dictate how much money can be taken from a young person's salary so they can secure a roof over their heads. Your policies have robbed our young people of hope. Your unwavering defence of the property market instead of young people sent them to transform politics at the last election and demand change. But you still didn't take that message. You cobbled together an unwanted three-party coalition that has continued the status quo. Out-of-control rents and blind loyalty to institutional landlords that are sucking the life out of our young people for profit. You told us a rent freeze couldn't be introduced. You told us a rent freeze was unconstitutional, but COVID changed everything. Overnight, you rightly introduced a rent freeze, and it proved your refusal to introduce a rent freeze was a policy-driven only. Now, young people will be watching this debate tonight, and in the week of the by-election, where door after door the issue of the housing crisis has been raised, and they will eagerly await the outcome of this debate. Now, you can stand on the side of young people. You can support this legislation and introduce a rent freeze for 3 years. You can finally say to the housing market that your government is taking a stand and you're intervening at last. Alternatively, you can vote it down, but that's your choice. Young people are not fools. Change will come, and you won't be able to stop it. You tried the last time, but the realignment of Irish politics will continue, and Sinn Féin and young people will be at the centre of it.
Gould. Minister, rents in Cork City, one of your rent pressure zones, rose by 6.3% in the last 12 months. That was despite a ban for 12 months on rent increase, or for 5 months in that time on rent increases. This figure goes to prove that the rent pressure zones don't work and have never worked. The average rent in Cork City now at the moment is €1,483 per month. In 2020, on average, someone on minimum wage took home €363 a week. How is someone supposed to live like that? How can you actually sit by and watch people living with that little money and then say it's okay for a rent increase of 8% to go in this year? Do you realise how many people are struggling to live week by week? Does anyone in this government ever take a minute to realise what it feels like to be constantly worried that today will be the day the letter comes that your rent is going to increase, and if you can pay it, and if you can't, you will lose your home? Sinn Féin's bill today gives people some peace of mind and security. Is that too much to ask for? People say the legacy of the last decade that Fine Gael have been is a generation of rent. The legacy of this government is the absolute failure to tackle investment funds. One of the largest investment funds in this state took in almost €30 million last year in rent. Ordinary people have struggled over the last 12 months But don't worry, thanks to this government, a complete failure to tackle the rental crisis. The investment fund increased the amount of rent they received in 2020 by €2 million. While ordinary people struggle to get by, you strip them of any protections or safety. Investment funds are increasing their turnover. This is what Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have done to the state and to ordinary renters.
I want to use my time here this evening to talk about rents outside of rent pressure zones like Roscommon Town and Ballinasloe in County Galway in my constituency. Rents in County Roscommon have increased by over 9% in the last year alone, with average rents now €783 per month, and they continue to rise. Average rents in Ballinasloe are at €743, up almost 8% on this time last year. However, in many cases, rents are much higher. County Galway is now one of 8 counties where average rents across the county are over €1,000. And these are not big urban areas. These are rural towns in the west of Ireland. Census 2016 showed that the majority of people living in a town like Ballinasloe are renters, either renting through the local authority or renting privately. And for these tenants renting privately, they have little or no protections. I have been contacted by people in Ballinasloe who are seeing their rent increase by between €200 and €300 in one go. And what are we to say to these workers and their families? And where rents are increased, tenants have no choice but to struggle on paying more because they have no other option. As it was put to me, there is nowhere else to rent in town and I cannot afford to save a deposit. Supply is also a major issue. In Roscommon Town, as I stand here this evening, there is one-bed apartment available to rent. In Ballinasloe, there are 2, and that's it. People are being trapped. They are paying extortionate and rising rents, and they're unable to save a deposit for a house. And this is particularly impossible for young people starting out. And on top of increasing rents, we saw a Eurostat report last month showing that goods and services here are joint second highest in all of Europe. Irish prices are the highest in Europe for housing, for heating and for light, 78% above the EU average. So now is exactly the time to ban rent increases. That and the fact that there is nothing in what the Minister announced last week in relation to rents that will help a single renter in constituencies like mine.
Party.
Cancórla, when Leo accused Sinn Féin of promising free housing, he exposed the Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael ideologically driven agenda that lit the embers of the housing crisis and has fanned the sparks that led to the catastrophe that we now witness across every community in this state. A catastrophe that means that most young people cannot even dream of ever owning their own home. I grew up in a council house. It was never a free house. Rent was paid in line with income coming into the house. The state bought an asset and it was paid back in spades. Public house building was an investment that benefited all within society. Those who needed help were able to get it. Those who wanted to rent were able to do so in an affordable way. Those who had relatively good incomes were able to purchase or build at a reasonable price in a good expectation that its value would rise steadily but in a stable manner. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael governments decided to change tact. Not because they were opposed to free houses, but because they wanted to make housing a speculative commodity. In fact, they did provide free houses, only they provided them to the vultures and the cuckoo funds and the speculators. Last year, Cancórla, the government handed €800 million in subsidies to private landlords. This year, the figure is set to top €1 billion. That's not even to mention the tax breaks, the loopholes or the sweetheart deals. Minister, you're providing free gaffs all right, but you're giving them to the very people who are fleecing our renters the length and breadth of this country. This catastrophe was a long time in the making, and it will take a long-term strategy and policy approach just such as that presented by Eoin Ó Broin to resolve it. But in the here and now, we need proposals that will help those at the coalface, at the natural outworking of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael policies, those policies of boom and bust cycles, of homelessness, of out-of-control rent prices. And again, Deputy Eoin O'Brien is bringing forward the proposals that will make a difference. This ban on rent increases bill brought forward because it's what renters need is a chance for Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael deputies to recognise the crisis of their own making, the catastrophe that is visiting families the length and breadth of this state. This bill is an opportunity to turn the tide and to recognise once and for all that our renters need a break, and this bill will provide that break.
Deputy Mairead Farrell.
I'd like to commend my colleague Eoin O'Brien for bringing forward this bill, because it's not only timely but it is absolutely necessary. Government policy continues to drive up the price of rents, and they are now in excess of anything that anyone can afford, and as are house prices. So I suppose in a lot of senses it seems to be mission accomplished for the government. And in my own home county of Galway, rents have now increased by 6% on last year, while rents for a double room in Galway City have increased by a massive 16%. Minister, the rent pressure zones that your predecessor introduced were always likely to fail, but now we have ample evidence for this. And they were supposed to limit increases in certain areas to 4% a year, but as Threshold CEO John Mark McCafferty rightly pointed out, Galway City is a designated pressure zone, and rents for double rooms have increased by 16% over the last year. So this is yet more evidence that the rent pressure zones are not being adhered to. Now, my colleague Eoin O'Brien's bill seeks to amend Section 19 of the Residential Tenancies Act by capping the current rent on new and existing tenancies for 3 years. And in Galway City, not far from where I live, in Merview, an apartment block is being developed where it is built to rent. And we know that these funds are investing in property to make the maximum return, which means more sky-high rents for tenants and pricing local people out of the market again. And the Minister for Finance decided to exempt these funds from the 10% stamp duty charge, which was supposed to deter them from these kind of bulk purchases. And this was done against the advice of his top civil servants, and will mean more bulk purchases by investment funds and ever-climbing rents for ordinary working people in Galway City who cannot afford to live in Galway City, who cannot afford to buy in Galway City. And that is simply not good enough, and it's policy after policy by this government that is excluding people in Galway from renting and from buying in their local areas. And Minister, we saw the same disregard for the former top civil servants of the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, the ESRI and the Central Bank, who said that the shared equity scheme would also push up prices. Minister, it's simply not good enough. We need action. We need action now. This is a good bill and should be supported by government.
Deputy Brian Stanley.
Cora, and welcome the opportunity to speak on this bill, which is about easing the pressure on renters by bringing in a 3-year rent freeze. And yes, it can be done. It has been shown it can be done during COVID. We've witnessed a massive escalation in rental costs across the country, and the very same in Laois Offaly over the last decade. And people need a rent freeze to give them a break. Since 2013, in 7 years alone, in Laois rents went up by 85.4%, and in Offaly 67.2%, a whopping increase by any standards. This dramatic surge in rental costs has put an incredible burden and stress upon families and workers struggling to keep a roof over their heads. And this has a consequence, Minister, on the health services and a range of other services in the state, not just housing. Figures recently released by Daft.ie outline that despite COVID, rents still went up in Laois and Offaly during the period of COVID. 3.4% in 12 months, the last 12 months. 6.6% in Offaly, 3.4% in Laois. Increasing rents also drive up house prices, as it makes it more attractive for landlords to buy them and rent them, which pushes out couples and single people who want to buy a home and to get going in life and to secure that roof over their head. Sinn Féin has proposed a range of measures, not just rent freezes, to tackle the housing crisis. This rent freeze is just one part of our plan. We would also introduce a tax credit of 8.5% to put a month's rent back into renters' pockets and to ease that pressure. We'd also increase capital investment to roll out affordable to purchase and cost rental homes at a significant scale. At present, there are no affordable to rent or to buy homes in Laois or Offaly, and there's no plans, unfortunately, to do this. Unfortunately, this needs to change. The government appear to have no plans for renters, or solutions for those looking to buy a home at an affordable price. What is also worrying is the problem facing us into the future of pensioners who will be forced to rent privately without sufficient income, Minister. And this is coming down the track quickly. There's an entire generation of people in their 30s, 40s and 50s that missed out on the opportunity to buy a home or secure local authority home. How does the government intend providing these people with secure housing as pensioners? Will it be housing assistance payment and rental subsidies that will be introduced with more taxpayers' money being thrown into the pockets of landlords? Is that the solution? And we need to face this head on. So to conclude,
Thank you, Deputy.
Sinn Féin is putting forward a range of solutions here this evening, one of them here this evening, to the housing crisis. And we hope the government will back these and other deputies in the House.
Minister, following your amendment, sadly the people will recognise the can being kicked down the road again. But sadly they can't wait until you or many here, unlike you or many here, for 12 months. Their rent is due every month. Your do-nothing attitude here this evening will not help anyone, but this bill will help everyone. The ban on rent increases Bill 2021, if implemented, will ensure that rents in existing tenancies will be capped at their rate on the date the new legislation is enacted, and new tenancies will be set according to the RTB rent index. If the bill becomes law, the ban on rent increases will run for 3 years with an annual review built into the legislation. It also includes a refundable tax credit which would give renters 1 month rent back. I've lost count the amount of people who contacted my office who are in despair, individuals and families. There are parents who are desperately worried about their adult children, worried that they'll ever get a chance to move out and to rent their own accommodation, let alone the chance of buying their own accommodation. Rents are too high, and the extortionate rates that people are being asked to pay are only rising, and that's proven again with the Daft report. In Dublin West, it's absolutely shocking. In Waterville and Blanchardstown, a one-bed is available for €1,650. A 3-bed in Castlewood and Hartstown, €2,200. Rathbourne and Ashtown, a 1-bed, €1,800. And a 3-bed in Castlecurra in Mulhuddard is available today for the sum of €2,500. The rents cannot be allowed to continue to rise year on year. The Minister cannot continue to use the Constitution as an excuse to avoid helping renters. COVID exposed that line. He can accept that the current crisis warrants a better response from this government, and unfortunately what we've heard tonight is a do-nothing response for another 12 months. Sinn Féin believe that it's wholly reasonable to ban rent increases for 3 years. We believe it's fair to give hard-pressed renters a break from extortionate rent rises, and we believe that everyone deserves a home that is affordable, that can be rented or purchased. And I commend Deputy Eoin O'Brien's bill, and I urge this government to change your position and to support this bill.
Munster.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. Firstly, I welcome the opportunity to speak on this bill. This bill seeks to ban rent increases for all existing and new tenancies for 3 years. It's not news to anybody that we have a housing emergency, and within that we have a private rental crisis. Rents have skyrocketed over a number of years. In my home county of Louth, the average rent is now €1,311 per month, but in reality it's between $1,400 and $1,600 per month. Rents have increased by 4.7% in the last year. In Meath, the average rent is $1,400, over $1,400, which is an increase of 4.9%, but in reality, it's anything from $1,600 to $1,800 a month in Meath. And in fact, since their lowest point after the economic crash, which incidentally was also caused by Fianna Fáil's housing policy, rents in Louth have increased by 114% and in Meath by 118%, Minister. Crazy. And unfortunately, there's no end in sight. Rents continue to soar and your government just continues to look the other way. In the most recent figures available from daft.ie, the increase in the last quarter alone was 2.1% in Louth and 2.5% in Meath. And until this government allows for the building of enough houses to deal with the demand out there, rents are never going to fall.
and I have no confidence that you will build houses, affordable houses. So we need this bill to ensure that rents cannot increase further for a period of 3 years. This is just one part. This bill is just one part of a suite of housing solutions that Sinn Féin has put forward, and your government has refused to help renters. You've turned the blind eye, and you're hiding behind legal excuses as the reason why you won't act. But we all know, Minister, that both yourself and your government colleagues are protecting your developer friends and landlords, and you always have done, and you always will. And you couldn't care less for the fact that renters are bled dry with extortionate rents month after month. So we need this bill as a protection for those renters, and I'm calling on all TDs, and particularly government TDs, to adopt a backbone and for once put their constituents first and make a stand and support this bill.
Ellis. Good. Minister, we're in a situation where rental prices are effectively outstripping monthly mortgage repayments. In that case, you might ask why someone wouldn't buy instead of renting. Well, it's because house prices have risen so high that it would be very difficult for most people to put together the deposit required for the house in the first place. This is an abnormal situation that indicates how broken and dysfunctional the property market is today. This generation is increasingly becoming a generation that will never be in a position to own a home and will be forever caught in a cycle of renting with its resulting instability. It is a reality today that for many people who are now dependent on renting and are being faced with spiralling rental costs, that they are no more than a rent payment away from being made homeless. Rent prices are becoming beyond the reach of many, and according to a report commissioned by daft.ie, the national average monthly rent stood at €1,443 in the first quarter of 2021, which is up by 1.7% over the past year and up by almost 95% from the low of €742 per month in late 2011. However, rental prices in Dublin average at €2,000 per month. The housing and rental market is like a pressure cooker at the moment, and the increasing incursion of cuckoo funds into the rental sector in particular is adding fuel to the fire on an already volatile and unstable property market. Those who will be most affected by this dysfunctional property market will be those looking for housing and reasonable rental costs. The resulting consequences of this dysfunction will be long housing waiting lists, homelessness and people not able to get on the property ladder. Your policies on rent pressure zones have ensured that people who are currently on either homeless HAP or housing HAP over the last number of years have been subjected to large increases in their HAP payments, amounting at times up to 4% every 2 years. This was because landlords could avail of the rules for such zones, allowing them to put such increases onto tenants irrespective of inflation. Our bill seeks to give renters a break by freezing rents for 3 years and a tax credit equivalent to 1 month's rent. This will go some way to lift the financial burden on hard-pressed renters and new tenants. Thank you.
Cronin.
Time is up on this renting crisis. The same old political faces doing the same old thing just does not work. Even when people can manage to find a place they can rent, the rent they're expected to pay is out of control. You've heard my colleagues say that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have had their chance, and ye had it, ye took it, and ye have blown it. You would prefer to tinker around the edges of a housing crisis that is, in fact, in my opinion, a humanitarian crisis. Because being able to afford a decent place to live is one of the most fundamental needs as human beings. And I see it day in and day out in my constituency in North Kildare. My constituency office in Naas, it's out the door with people looking to see where they are on the Kildare housing list, sometimes waiting up to 15 years. And they're very, very lucky to even find a place in North Kildare, a 3-bedroom for under €2,000. I see people's pain and fear when they cannot afford a home or a place they can afford. Homes is what people need. They are in a decent modern society guided by the true principles of republicanism, where the people's business, the public's business, is the most important business, coming before any political sector or business sector or profit. I am proud of Eoin Ó Broin's bill. It is in the best traditions of republicanism, as far away as possible from the survival of the fittest government mentality that cheapens and degrades us all. Our bill looks after our people, it dignifies them and their lives, not casting them aside but raising them up. Our bill will ban rent increases for 3 years for new and existing tenancies. This will bring security, peace of mind and the ability to plan ahead in renters' lives. That's so important for a family. On top of banning rent increases, it will make sure every renter gets a month's rent back in their pocket through a refundable tax credit. It's called respect for our renters, Ara. In Sinn Féin, we have a plan to fix the housing crisis, and this legislation is just one step. Your amendment is disappointing, but I am urging my constituency colleagues in North Kildare and all across the House to come with us for this, for our people, their dignity and their future. Big Lynn.
Thanks, Cathaoirleach. Minister, I would like to commend my Sinn Féin colleague and spokesperson for housing, Eoin Ó Broin, for bringing this bill to the House. The Ban Rent Increase Bill 2021 will give families and workers living in uncertain times a little bit of comfort as they plan their finances without the fear of rent increasing. There is a huge concern and a growing call for a ban on rent increases in my own constituency of Meath West, as rents have gone out of control in the last 10 years. To rent a house in County Meath in 2011, a family would have paid €672 per month. Now, in 2021, under the watchful eye of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, that same house will now cost almost €1,300. Minister, that is nearly double the cost 10 years ago, and it hits the most vulnerable in society as families count their last few shillings as they pay their rent, utility bills and try to put food on the table. Our offices are inundated with people not able to pay these extortionate rents. To rent a home in Westmeath in 2011, it would have cost €525 per month. 10 years later, it's now an average of €850 per month. We can see the rents in every county rising at an extremely worrying pace. And in County Meath, rents increased by 6% in the last quarter of 2020. Who is to blame for the current rental market? In 2016, our housing spokesperson introduced a rent certainty bill, which would have stopped the enormous jump in rents over the last 5 years. But who blocked it? Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil by voting it down 5 times. Why would the government parties have done this? They did it to protect the vulture funds, the cuckoo funds and the big landlords. People renting live with the fear of eviction every day as some landlords continue to raise their rents, which leads to families becoming homeless. Previous Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael-led governments have failed to deliver on affordable housing. They have failed the people of Ireland, and during the last election, the voters made it clear that they wanted a change in direction. But you teamed up together to make sure that didn't happen. In 12 months' time, when you look at this bill again, there will be a lot more people homeless or in emergency accommodation. Thank you.
I would like to commend once again my colleague Eoin Ó Broin for bringing forward this bill. Should this bill be passed, it will ban rent increases for all existing renters and new renters for up to 3 years, with a rental review to be considered by the Minister on an annual basis. This concept is not new and has operated in many countries around the world. The cost of renting has spiralled in every county in Ireland, with the average rent now standing at €1,256. Take my own county of Wexford, which according to daft.ie has seen a year-on-year increase of 8.9%. Young working people and college students are financially trapped by the huge cost of renting and the ever-increasing house prices. Have we learned absolutely nothing from the bubble markets and the so-called Celtic Tiger era? Young working people today are as ambitious as any generation before them. They want to be able to settle down in their own home. They want to rent at reasonable prices. However, this is not the case. Homes have become the new cash cow, the new trading commodity, no different than shares or gold, and I dare say encouraged and protected by the many laws passed in favour of big developers and big landlords by successive governments. Landlords know that they have a product that gives them market power. They exploit that market power with pricing above the marginal costs. This legislation is one of the components needed to protect renters, who are mostly young and starting off their own independent lives. We all have a responsibility not to default on the upcoming generation. The history of our country with landlordism was not a good one. This is not a battleground we want to relive again. It is important we recognise the difficulties and the consequences that high rents are having on our young citizens and the consequences on our society as a whole. The bill to ban increases for 3 years is a moderate ask and will help in some ways to create a temporary breathing space for families and individual citizens who are being exploited to the last cent. I hope all TDs will see fit to support this bill, but I see the government have done their usual delaying tactics and added another year. Maybe the Minister and the government should adopt Johnny Logan's song, What's Another Year, as their theme song for 2021. For Margaret.
And Deputy O'Brien to close.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to all of the deputies who spoke in support of the bill. Minister, it's 5 years since I first introduced a bill to constrain rents in the private rental sector on this floor. And at that time, in fact, your party supported that bill to link rents to inflation. And all of the arguments that I've heard tonight, and they're Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael arguments, even when they're made by Green Party deputies, are the same arguments that were used 5 years ago not to take the kind of action that I proposed back then. And because Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael refused to listen to the opposition, not just 5 years ago, but on the other 4 occasions when rent certainty was voted down, renters are in a much worse position today than they were then. And what I'm hearing tonight is, just as Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael refused to listen to the opposition back then to the great detriment of renters, history is now repeating itself. And the one argument that nobody on the government side has explained is why they think any rent increase is acceptable over the next period of time. Yes, linking rents to inflation, if inflation stays below 4%, is better than 4%, but inflation is currently running at 1.9% and rising. And what happens if it rises to 3% or 4%? Are we really saying that renters paying an average rent of €1,750 in Dublin or €1,300.50 outside can bear any level of rent increase? Are we seriously saying that new entrants to the Dublin market who are paying between €2,000 and €3,000 a month can bear any level of rent increase in the current years? And I have to say the answer to that question is a very categorical no, which is why the correct policy at this point in time is an emergency 3-year ban on rent increases in the private rental sector. Now, Minister O'Brien said that a ban won't increase supply. And of course he's right, but nobody on this side of the chamber claimed it would. It is simply to stop rents rising any further. What would increase supply if government would invest the hundreds of millions of euros in the thousands of affordable cost rental units of accommodation annually that every agency advising government for years has recommended. We have not seen that to date. I await with great interest the Minister's housing plan and budget 2022. But on the basis of the record of both this government in its first year and its predecessor, that level of investment and the volumes of supply of cost rental accommodation that we want to see are unlikely to be forthcoming. The Minister also said we have to be mindful of the impact on landlords, and this is one of the arguments that I just don't understand. What this bill proposes is actually incredibly modest. What it's saying is landlords can continue to charge the high rents that are currently locked into our market, significantly above the peak of the Celtic Tiger. So, in fact, any investor, any new investment into the market is investing at an exceptionally high level of return. So, in fact, I don't see how a 3-year temporary ban would have any negative impact on levels of investment. And the Minister is right. For 3 years, I have been urging both the last government and this government to undertake an urgent review of the chronic loss of accidental and semi-professional landlord properties in the market over the last 3 years. Neither government has been willing to do that. Yes, we have a problem, but insisting that renters have to pay ever more extortionate level of rents is not the solution. Government should do what I've advised them to do for 3 years, ask the Residential Tenancies Board and ESRI to conduct a study of why those landlords are leaving and what can be done to slow down that disorderly exit. But the idea that the solution lies in the pockets of renters is simply not acceptable. And I have to say the argument around protecting property rights is absolutely bogus. If we can stop rent increases for 2 years, as was done in 2014 and 15, if we can stop rent increases during a pandemic, we can absolutely stop rent increases now, and there is a significant legal opinion in the public domain to give effect to that. So the arguments I made at the start I'm going to make again. We have to ban rent increases for 3 years. Renters simply cannot take any more. We also have to reduce rents, and the quickest and legally most simple way of doing that is a refundable tax credit to put a month's rent back in every renter's pockets for that same emergency period of 3 years. And we need hundreds of millions of euros through exchequer expenditure and government borrowing invested in the delivery of at least 4,000 affordable cost rental units on an annual basis every year until we built up that stock. We also need to see action on standards, and the NCT-style certification for minimum standards should be introduced as a matter of urgency. And we also have to have tenancies of indefinite duration. And I know the government have said they're going to do it, but I have to say what I understand they're going to introduce is not tenancies of indefinite duration, and we'll judge that when it comes. The bottom line is this. Once again, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and regrettably the Green Party are walking away from renters. They are siding with the institutional interests of our private rental market, and the people who will suffer will be hard-pressed renters. And I think it is a shame that anybody thinks that the government's deferral of reading for a second stage for 12 months is anything other than a cynical ploy to avoid their blushes of having to vote against such an urgent and eminently sensible measure. And on that basis, I commend the bill to the House.
The debate now having concluded, the question is that the amendment be made. Na teachtaí atá ar thaobh na ceiste Aberdís Tó. Na teachtaí atá ina cuine Aberdís Níl.
Níl.
Is dóil go bhfuil an ceist rite. In my opinion, the question is carried.
Vote all.
Okay. As a division has been demanded, the division is deferred until the weekly division time tomorrow evening.